All right, so in this video, we're going to be starting Unit 8, the circulatory system, and we're going to be talking about blood. Now, in the anatomy textbook, blood is this whole unit, and so there's a whole lot more that we're not covering that we could. We're just going to kind of hit the high points, stuff that will probably be familiar to you with some new information mixed in there. So let's get started talking about blood. So there's just a picture of some blood moving through a blood vessel to talk to you about what blood is. It is a life-sustaining transport vehicle of the cardiovascular system. It is part of the cardiovascular system. It is also considered a tissue, which we'll get into in a moment. But blood is composed of lots of different parts, lots of different, and it has lots of different functions in those parts. And those three functions can be those functions can be summarized into three basic groups, and that is transportation, regulation, and protection. Now, as we look at this is the best picture I could come up with. So I'm going to just kind of weed through it and help you understand what's going on here. So transport functions include respiration. So think about delivering oxygen and CO2, oxygen into the cells, CO2 out of the cells. Nutrients throughout the body too. That GIT is gastrointestinal tract. That's just from the digestive system. It transport for hormones from the endocrine glands, transport of metabolic waste, which CO2 would fit into that, but also urea and some different other things that are produced from digestion, and those wastes are filtered out through the kidneys and other places in order to be dealt with, and we'll talk more about that in other units. The regulation is a catch-all kind of term, but regulation includes maintaining body temperature, maintaining pH of the blood and the body's tissues and fluids, and just maintaining enough water content in cells and in the blood in order to keep you alive. Your blood pressure is essentially a count of how much fluid you have sustaining your body. If you think of a plant that doesn't have enough water, what does it do? It wilts. Well, we can wilt too. We just don't look wilted when we wilt. We just don't live. And so the blood's purpose is to keep all that regulated. And then protection. It protects against fluid loss. So that's what you see, that reservoir of substances. We're not going to talk about hemostasis there, but we will talk about white blood cells protecting against disease by phagocytosis. And the way that you could sum that up is just preventing infection. All right, so it has this protective quality as well to it. Blood is the only fluid tissue in the body. Tissue, remember, is a group of cells that have a particular function. So blood is a group of cells. It is made up of lots of different kinds of things. The fluid portion, or the non-living portion of blood, is called plasma. And if you take blood and centrifuge it, you will see the plasma kind of float to the top there. It's about 55% of the blood. It's the least dense component, so that's why it floats to the top. 55% or so. Then you have what every single thing I've read calls the buffy coat. That probably means something. But the buffy coat is the leukocytes, which are a fancy word for white blood cells, and the platelets, which we'll talk about both of those in a second. And this is less than 1% of your blood. The other 45% is called the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells, or RBCs. And this is the most dense component because this is actual cellular component here. And blood makes up approximately 8% of someone's body weight. And so you can just do the math and you're like, wow, I have a lot of blood in me. All right. And so the blood is a living thing in that it is composed of living cells, but not every portion of it is living. So that's, make sure that you understand that those cells are suspended in that liquid plasma. Plasma is about 90% water, but it's not all water. You can just look at the color of it. It has this straw colored liquid. It's always called straw colored too, but I mean, I would just call it like pale yellow. In that plasma, there can be as many as 100 other dissolved solutes, nutrients, gases, hormones, waste, protein, other inorganic ions like calcium, sodium, chlorine, all those different things that are going on in your blood. Um, Proteins are probably the most abundant solute in the blood because the proteins actually regulate the blood, the pH of the blood, and so forth. Um, and they remain in the blood to, like I said, to kind of keep things moving, to keep things regulated. They're not taken up by cells all the time. But think of your blood as a way the body is able to talk to one another. You know, when I pick up my phone to call someone, there are these invisible airwaves out there. The blood is like those airwaves, except for visible, and it's made of fluid. You get the idea. All right. So the blood has several what are called formed elements in it, and here are the three formed elements that are found in blood: uh, leukocytes, or WBCs, or white blood cells; erythrocyte, erythrocytes. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. Those are red blood cells, and then your platelets, which are actually cell fragments. They're not actually whole living cells. They did come from a cell at one point, but now they're just kind of broken off cell pieces. Most of these formed elements survive in the bloodstream for only a few days, and so this sort of thing is constantly being recycled. These blood cells originate in the bone marrow. They do not divide, and so once they're made, they live and they do their thing, and then are they're recycled. So they don't divide. They're not self-perpetuating. Is another way of thinking about that. So let's look at the red blood cells. They always remind me of that kind of candy that's smooshed in the middle. That's, I don't know what that's called, but I think I've seen it before. Really small cells, like 7.5 micrometers, which is really small compared to other cells. And their big job is gas transport. They are dedicated to the respiratory system, in their whole function, their whole shape, and everything about them has to do with carrying oxygen. Even their shape, what have we talked about with shape before? Not so much in this class, but we will more and more, is this concept of complementarity of shape and function. And the shape of this cell, they look at it, it's got this pinched in middle. Why does it does that? Because it has more surface area to volume ratio, which allows it to do its job more. And it's filled with this protein called hemoglobin. A large portion of its innards, like 97% of the cell volume, is hemoglobin, not counting water. All right. These cells are totally all into carrying oxygen. They don't even have a nucleus. They don't have mitochondria, because what would mitochondria do? Well, we know what mitochondria do. They use oxygen to do cellular respiration, right? Well, if these cells need ATP, rather than use oxygen, they do so by fermentation. So they don't consume oxygen. Their whole job is to carry oxygen and get it to the body cells. And so, very much structure equals function kind of idea here. Some of the capillaries that they travel through are actually smaller than the blood cells, and so they have this shape. Also allows them to squeeze into tight places and not get caught in those places. And so again, shape equals function with these guys. Very good at what they do. Here's a picture of hemoglobin. It is just a big old protein, and its whole job is to carry around oxygen. It does that by having iron in it. See these heme groups here? This is basically just an iron. It's 4 subgroups. You don't need to know the 4 subgroup thing, but each one of these irons can carry an oxygen, and 97% of that cell is filled with this hemoglobin, and 45% of your blood is filled with these RBCs. And so your blood can carry lots and lots of oxygen. Next are the leukocytes, and I have kind of a more fantasy type picture with these, but leukocytes is a big big well. White blood cells, there's lots of them. That word white blood cells covers a lot of ground. There are lots of different kinds of white blood cells, and we're not going to get into the different kinds of white blood cells. We will do so more in the immune unit other than this one. The big function here is that they defend themselves, or they defend the body against disease. These cells do have nuclei, they do have organelles because they have more function to do. They basically move through the blood system. They can also just move throughout all of your tissues, and they have something called positive chemotaxis. So positive means plus, or positive means going toward. Chemo, chemical, taxis is moving. And so positive chemotaxis moving means that they're moving toward a chemical. So they sense something that's not you, and it sets alarm bells off in them, and they move toward it to respond to that, right? Whether it's a bee sting or it's some sort of virus or whatever that you have. And so these cells, big function, fight off infection. We're going to get into that. We'll have a whole unit on the immune system, so we're not going to get into their function very deeply here. And then lastly are the platelets. Remember, platelets are these cell fragments. They actually come from a cell called a megakaryocyte, mega, big, karyonucleocyte cell. And so these are just broken off pieces of this megakaryocyte. And their function is to form a temporary plug to help seal breaks in blood vessels. So you cut your finger, the platelets are there to make a little plug that clogs them up. If you look at these guys, they're probably not very good at circulating, right? They're the opposite of the red blood cells in that they're not shaped very well to move through things. And if you get a clump of them, they're probably going to stay clumped. And so that's kind of what they do. There's actually a gas that circulates in the blood called nitric oxide, or just NO for short, and it keeps these mobile, keeps them from clotting up. But when that clotting is necessary, they will clot together and kind of form this gel, which you're all familiar with if you've ever had a wound in that regard. And they can, to form a scab, they can join with this protein called fibrin. All right. And they can, let the phone go ahead and ring out. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but I definitely can, and I'm completely distracted by it. All right, there we go. So blood coagulates, you've heard this before, or clots with these platelets getting caught up in this fibrin, and it forms a clot. This happens to do with like larger blood vessel breaks, and it forms into this gel, and that gel can dry and it forms a scab, which you're familiar with. All right, so let's look at the different blood groups. There are A, B, O blood groups. You've heard of these things before: type A, type B, type O, type AB blood. These are all things that a person can have. And how does this work? Well, the way it works is the body can produce either A or B or neither one. All right. And so type A blood has an anti-B antibody in it. Type B blood has an anti-A antibody in it. And so they don't like one another. It's another way of thinking about it. All right. And so then type AB blood, since it has both types, it doesn't have any of those antibodies. So it can actually accept all different kinds of blood. Type O blood is against both. And so it can only accept O, but it doesn't have anything. It's not A or B. And so if you have type O, you're typically referred to as the universal donor because it doesn't show up as A or B. It shows up as blank. And so anybody can take in the O, whereas AB isn't against anything. And so it can receive. It's called the universal recipient here. And then there's this whole other thing called the RH factor, which I thought I had a slide for, but I guess I don't. So the RH factor is another factor that can be found in blood, and there are actually 52 of these different Rh factors. And if someone is Rh positive, it's typically just one of them that shows up, and they have this particular antibody on their blood or antigen on their blood that causes the production of antibody, and they're called Rh positive. About 85% of Americans are Rh positive. Well, someone who's Rh negative will form antibodies against those positive blood, which is not a problem because we normally don't have each other's blood in us. It only causes a problem in one instance, in that if a person has a fetus developing in them, if a woman is pregnant, then the woman has negative, but the fetus has positive, then the woman's body can actually form an immune response against the fetus. Now, the first pregnancy, this doesn't cause a problem, but with the second pregnancy, it can actually cause an immune response. And so this is why prenatal care is so important, because the physicians can pick this up and they can have you take a medicine that doesn't cause you to reject your baby, which is, a good thing. And so the Rh factor is just another thing like this ABO, in that it causes the blood to show up a certain way, and it causes the blood to produce anti against the other things, if that makes sense.